Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of British Heart Foundation live and ticking events. My name is Fearghal McKinney, Head of British Heart Foundation Northern Ireland. This month is Stress Awareness Month, which has been held every April since 1992 to increase public awareness about both the causes and cures for our modern stress epidemic. What is stress? It's our body's response to pressures from challenging situations in life. It can be a feeling of being overwhelmed or under pressure. And it's normal to feel like this sometimes, and a certain amount of stress can be healthy. But if you're feeling like this more and more over time and you're struggling to cope, it's time to make some changes. Stress, it's important to say, itself isn't a mental health condition, but it's a sign that something is wrong. Stress is a common experience, especially when we're living through a pandemic or coping with health problems. Nearly half of British adults feel stressed every day or every few days, a recent survey suggests. Having health problems or seeing a loved one go through them can be a huge source of stress. Under pressure, people often comfort eat, exercise less, sleep less, drink more alcohol or smoke. Unfortunately, these responses will not help your stress or your heart. Slowing down, eating a balanced diet, and gentle exercise have been shown to help your mental well-being and your heart health. A Mental Health Foundation survey found that the three most helpful ways of decreasing your stress are spending time alone, exercise and hobbies, and talking to loved ones. At the BHF, we're also here to help. Our Heart Helpline is open weekdays 9 to 5. Our nurses are here for you. Just call or click away. And David has posted that link on the screen below. So let's first of all take a little poll. And how would you rate your understanding of how stress affects the heart? The poll is a 1 to 5 rating. Number 1 is very little, and number 5 is a lot. So without further ado, let me introduce our brilliant speakers who will tell us more about stress and the heart. We're delighted to be joined by Rachel Boothroyd, who was diagnosed with coronary heart disease when she was just 37 while working as a lawyer. Rachel will discuss how she feels stress impacted her heart condition and how she has since changed her working life. We're also honoured to be joined by Dr. Mark Nixon, Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh, who'll be sharing his research into how we can protect against high levels of stress hormones that cause heart disease. And we'll also be joined by Davison, Senior Cardiac Nurse at the BHF for the Q&A session. You can post your questions in the Q&A function and we'll try to answer as many as possible. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Rachel Boothroyd. Sorry about the slip up, Rachel, just then. My script dropped off the screen. But perhaps you can talk to us now about how stress at work impacted your heart condition and how your working life has changed since. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Fearghal. Thanks for that introduction, and hello to everybody out there. Good to see you all this afternoon. I am, as well as a recovered from heart disease person, I'm also recovering from COVID at the moment. So I'm sure many of you out there can relate to that. So hence, if I cough and sound a bit nasal, that's not heart disease. That's good old COVID. So yeah, my purpose being here today, and I don't have any slides, I just want to chat and tell you really about my story of heart disease and stress. And, you know, like many of you, I thought heart disease was just a risk thing that I could manage. You know, all those classic symptoms that causes that Fearghal was talking about just now. I thought, you know, got to manage my weight, I'd watch what I drink, don't smoke. I haven't got a family history. And I thought, well, yeah, I can really stay on top of that. But actually, like many people, heart disease came into my life. And that's probably going to be true for most of us on this call. You know, it's one of the biggest killers in the UK still. And so it's probably going to touch all of our lives. So I'm really privileged to share my story and hope that gives you some inspiration maybe to make changes or encourage other people to make changes. So my story started when I was 37, so that's a little while ago now. And whilst I was working as a lawyer in the city. And the thing is, I didn't really find it a particularly stressful job, the day-to-day work. I was particularly known for being very calm. In fact, that was one of my trademark elements of my style as a lawyer. And I was doing really well. So I worked in the city and work was going fantastically, but things started to change in my body. And I started to notice that walking wasn't quite as easy as it used to be. And it was like life closed in on me a little bit. I started to get more taxis because I just thought, I was pain in my chest and pain down my arms. And it really couldn't understand what it was. But I thought, I'm a lawyer, I can work this out. I know what it is. I'm getting old. Now I was 37 at the time. I thought, this is it. This is old age coming to get me. And so what did I do? I went to the gym, even though I had crushing pain in my chest by this stage, and redoubled my efforts there. And there was one incident that I particularly remember. I was walking over London Bridge, but if any of you know London Bridge, it's a really gentle slope to get to the office. And I was struggling. And I started to sweat, like comedy sweating. I could feel beads of sweat coming off my forehead, held onto the handrail and doubled over because I got this crushing pain in my chest and pains in my arms, which actually were the first symptom to appear, these aching pains down both arms. I remember being bent over double and commuters streaming past me into work. And I remember people looking at me in a funny way. And I could almost see myself through their eyes of like, there really is something wrong. And I only actually went to the doctor because a friend had said to me, look, you're really not right. And I went to the doctor, and you probably can't see I'm quite slim. I was quite slim. Like I say, I was vegetarian, had a good diet, I did meditation, did all the tick boxes were right. And the doctor actually said, look, ridiculous. I can tell by looking at you, you haven't got heart disease, but you've got pain in your arms, pain in your chest. And by that time, I had pain in my throat as well. And she said, they're always on at us at the moment about women and heart disease. So I'm just going to have to refer you. She said, but no rush. And I felt like a bit of a fraud. Now, having spoken to lots of other people since, that can be a really common feeling, like you're making it up. So I put off going to the cardiologist, but I did eventually go. And I did a stress ECG, so on the treadmill, and then the needle went off. The nurse ran out of the room. And then I was in front of the cardiologist with my reports, with him talking about how many false positives there are and how this very likely could be a false positive, even though I'd had all the symptoms as well. And it was before Christmas, and he said, hey, there's no rush. We don't need to do anything about it. Let's put it off till after Christmas, because I was busy. I had a lot on. I had Christmas parties to go to, and I didn't want it to interrupt my life. And I certainly didn't want to relate to myself as having any kind of issue with heart disease. Now, looking back, I can only think it just wasn't my time to go. I was so lucky, because he had a premonition and he rang me, and I was all dressed up, ready to go to my partner's lunch. And he said, Rachel, can you come in? And I'm like, yeah, sure. He said, come in now. And by lunchtime, I was on a bed in a scanner with a tube going through my artery and on the top of my hip, awake and looking inside my heart and seeing that it was very, very closed in the main artery. And that artery is actually known as the Widowmaker. And it turns out I had 99% block at the beginning of the Widowmaker artery. So they put a stent straight in. And I was really lucky, because there'd been research being done, and these drug-eluting stents, they release drugs so that it's less likely to be blocked. And that was partly funded by the BHF. So thank you, BHF. That went in, and do you know what? It's magic. It was instant. I felt better straight away. Like the first time I'd had a breath for years almost. And then you're better. Yeah. So I got a leaflet that just said, if you don't have a manual job, you're ready to go back to work within a week. Physically, perhaps ready, but mentally not so much. And one of the things that really plagued me was, why me? Like, I've managed this risk. I'm female, I'm slim, I eat well, I don't drink, I don't smoke. You write very boring songs about me. I don't have any vices here. And having done a lot of inquiry, I came to the conclusion that really it is stress. And stress can take many forms. And I know we're going to hear from Mark about that. And it's still a source of extreme fascination to me. And there were a number of factors that maybe resonate for you or people around you. And really, please share these. So the first one I would say is context. The work itself, the writing of contracts, the negotiation of contracts, not stressful, but the law firm environment and culture was extremely stressful. I often found myself as the only woman in most meetings. I was on the managing board. I was the only woman on the managing board. And it was very much about a sense of isolation. I didn't have much of a support network as I'd got quite senior. And that isolation in itself is a cause of stress. The second one is that I'd fallen out of love with being a lawyer. I really didn't like it. I was not doing something that I loved. I remember I used to go in every day and press 7 on the lift. I was like, I can't flipping believe I'm in here again pressing 7. 11 years I was pressing 7, right? And it was time to look and do something different. And I didn't think that was possible. I felt very boxed in. Yeah. And the third one is something that Fearghal touched on, is I'd let my support networks go. I'd maybe work longer hours, I socialise with people at work, but I wasn't nourishing myself, and I wasn't perhaps being vulnerable enough with those I loved and who loved me. And support is incredibly important as a stress diffuser. So forward a few years and here I am, and how am I doing is what a lot of people ask. And whenever I meet people at the BHF, they're like, how are you doing now? Well, at 3 years after I had my stent, I had my son, who is now just had his 12th birthday. So I'm a mum, which is fantastic. And of course, brings all another lot of stress. And 11 years, I left the law. And I've set up a consultancy and I have work I completely love. And I go into companies and law firms and I make teams work really well together and make sure people are able to be vulnerable with each other and support each other. And they have so much more fun doing it and they get better results. So in a way, I'm kind of healing myself with that work. And recently I've started working with lawyers specifically who want to change career, who don't know how to do it. And I help them do that. So in a way, heart disease really has dictated what I've done with the rest of my life. And in a way, we all find healing with that, don't we? And I just want to say thank you so much to the BHF, because coming out of hospital and when you're given diagnosis, these are critical points in our lives and times when we need a friend, and a friend who really knows and understands what we're going through. And I know now, I've made a lot of friends at the BHF, that they can do that for people. And so, they can be that friend in those times of need. I'll leave that there. That's kind of my story.
Not quite, Rachel, because just a couple of things that you provoked me in terms of questions. Obviously, you talked about 11 years, but how long was the pain and how were you dealing with that? It strikes me that you were absorbing it and getting on, not dealing with it. Can you reflect on that a bit?
Yeah, I was misdiagnosed at first with some kind of rare thing because I didn't look like heart disease. So I had maybe 6 months of not quite being able to get a breath. Then I had to go back to work, and then I had the pains in my arms, and they were strong. And I would get home and get into a yoga position to try and relieve the pain in my arms. And that escalated up to, from September to the December, that turned into 2 aching arms, into aching arms, an elephant on my chest and a grip around my throat. And I had the operation probably 22nd December, something like that. So it once those achy arms started, it was quite rapid. And what was I doing? Denial. I couldn't comprehend that heart disease could be part of my life. And I kept going to the gym. Mad, I know. I'm not a stupid person, but, denial is possible in all of us, I think.
And you're obviously aligning what happened to you with stress, and you're continuing. So there's kind of two things. There's the medical side of what was happening to you, and clearly then the intervention. But had you made changes in your life earlier, sought advice about stress, etc., would that have made a difference?
I honestly don't think there was a single thing more that I could have done. You know, I exercised, I had an incredibly healthy diet, I don't have a family history, I meditated every day, did yoga every day. That's why I went on this quest of like, what on earth is it? I haven't got any of the classic behaviors. So I other than changing career, which I think would have helped, I'd wanted to do something different for quite a long time. Yeah.
Wow. And life now is good?
Life is magic now. I'm actually really quite nauseating, I think, to a lot of my friends, if I'm so happy. I have lovely support, and support, you know, getting support doesn't come naturally to me. And I think that's something that has been a huge breakthrough, really quite recent, to put support in place and have that around me. So not only do I do work I love, but I'm not doing it on my own. I'm doing it with support. So I have backup, I have associates, and that's the game changer for me, I think.
Yeah. And I suppose some of this, the information that you're imparting, and we thank you, by the way, very much for sharing your story. It's hugely valuable that people understand. But I suppose in the context of COVID and people isolated at home, what advice would you have in terms of how people might feel stress now in their lives? And given that you know the potential, at least, for that to impact on heart.
Yeah, that's worried me a lot actually over the pandemic, because there's a great book called The Heart Speaks, which really spoke to me about isolation and the impact of that. And it's worried me terribly about, just self-isolate. What is that? That's creating, to me, that's creating the dynamics for what happened to me to happen to other people. Use any means possible to reach out and connect. This is great. This is what the BHF has done here is fantastic. And there is real connection from this, but also neighbors, find it, make it a quest, make it as important as your exercise, make it as important as your diet. That's the big lesson I've learned.
Yeah. And the one thing that struck me about what you said earlier was, and you didn't say this way, but you used the word, and I'm assuming, don't be afraid of your vulnerability.
Yeah, I actually go into companies now and get people to do exercises to be vulnerable with each other. In a way, I'm teaching my 35-year-old self, this would have really helped. Yeah, and just to share. And it's magic when it happens, and it can happen at work, and it can happen in all different places, that when we share those, people love us for our vulnerability, not our strength. And, that's been a big learning for me.
Yes. And can I ask, is allowed me to ask, just in terms of your heart health now, how are things?
Well, I did a triathlon in September.
Fantastic.
And I'm so competitive, which probably goes to the heart disease personality, but, it came to the final leg and I was running, and there were some people quite a lot younger than me, and I overtook them and I was like, yes, I'm better.
That's fantastic.
So yeah, it's always, I always have a mind to it. There's no psychological complete freedom from something like what happened to me. So I'm always aware of it. But in as much as is possible, I'm free of it.
Yeah. And I think that's important for a wider audience to hear that, particularly those that may be experiencing the early stages of anything to do with heart and circulatory disease, that with the right intervention, and not in all circumstances, of course, but that, to hear that you, with a stent, can do a triathlon and beat those around you. That's good.
What I do, yeah. And I do consider myself very, very fortunate. Yeah.
Thank you. So Rachel, listen, all I want to do, I've already thanked you, but I would just like to thank you again. It's tremendously inspirational, what you have to say. We thank you for sharing it. And now we are joined by Dr. Mark Nixon, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Edinburgh. And of course, Mark will be talking about stress, but you're going to talk about how we can protect against high levels of stress hormones that cause heart disease. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
That's great. Fearghal, thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my slides on the screen. Yes, excellent. Thank you very much. I just want to add my thanks to Rachel as well. It was obviously a very difficult thing that you went through, but it's lovely to hear the kind of silver lining that's come out of it for you. And again, yeah, thank you for sharing your story with us. Another thank you, I guess, is for everyone coming along today, and to the BHF themselves for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all. Hopefully, I'm going to try and take you on a bit of a journey through the links between stress and cardiovascular disease. So as Fearghal has said, I'm a BHF-funded research fellow here at the Centre for Cardiovascular Science at the University of Edinburgh. And the work that we do here, the work that I and others undertake, is really aimed at understanding the basic underlying biology of stress hormones and cardiovascular risk factors. And our goal really here is to improve patient care by identifying ways to prevent and to treat cardiovascular disease. And to do that, an obvious starting point really is to ask, who gets cardiovascular disease? What are the characteristics? And can that help us predict how we can intervene to break a chain of events that lead to cardiovascular disease? It can be explained in part, Rachel's already alluded to this, but it can be explained in part by a number of risk factors. Many of these, hopefully you'll have heard of already, but obesity, for example, is a major risk factor, as is high blood sugar levels, as is high blood pressure, and indeed as is high cholesterol levels or abnormal lipid levels. Smoking is the other major risk factor. It does remain a huge risk factor for heart disease. Thankfully, smoking habits and public health policy over the past number of decades have been influential in reducing cardiovascular risk, but we're still left with a really big problem here. And indeed, the huge effort that's underway now is mainly through BHF-funded researchers, and that's into understanding how these other risk factors manifest and how we can treat them to stop the snowball effect, if you like, of developing heart disease. And that, of course, brings us to today's topic, which is stress. And I wanted to start out by asking, rather counterintuitively, you might think, if you think stress gets a wee bit of an unfair hearing. Of course, the word stress, as Fearghal's already mentioned, has negative connotations. And when we look at its definition, we can see that it's defined as a feeling of emotional or physical tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. And I think overall, we'd agree that from society's perspective, stress is an overwhelmingly bad thing. And again, as Fearghal has already alluded to, the bad news here is that we're not running out of sources of stress anytime soon. Sorry, stuck on my slides here. We've had, obviously, a global COVID pandemic to deal with over the past number of years. That's brought about a number of challenges in terms of working from home, that's affected our work-life balance. We've got the cost of living crisis currently hitting ourselves, along with the threat of global war over the atrocities that's happening in Ukraine. I think even one of these would be cause for stress in anyone's life, but all of them together. And it's no wonder that we're a world full of people feeling that there's no escape. So it's pretty clear, I think, from that stress is bad, right? But of course, things are rarely black and white, and that's especially true in this case. And the first evidence that stress actually might be advantageous comes from our Stone Age ancestors. So from an evolutionary perspective, our ancestors would have experienced such adverse circumstances when confronted with large predatory animals. And the body's way of dealing with this perceived threat or stressor is to initiate what we now call the fight or flight response. And that allows the caveman or cavewoman to either fight off the threat or to run away. So of course, that's a really clear demonstration of the vital importance of stress response. But you might argue that in the modern world, the days of dealing with mountain lions as we hunt for food have hopefully for most of us passed. And you wouldn't be wrong. But as Fearghal and Rachel have discussed already, many of us have swapped the kind of acute mountain lion stressor, if you like, for the chronic work stressor, as well as all of the other stressors that we've just mentioned. And really a key issue around stress here is how we perceive it. And as humans, that's very much a feeling. That's what I want to highlight here. It's a definition states it's a feeling. And therefore, accordingly, it elicits a number of behavioral or emotional responses. So, for example, it can cause unhealthy eating or drinking habits. It can cause you to pick up a cigarette, and it can also affect your sleep patterns. But aside from that, and those are things that we've talked about already today, there is a more biological or indeed physiological response that our body has to stress. And that's what I'm going to dive into in our remaining time today. And in particular, I want to give you a brief insight into our work here on the primary stress hormone cortisol and its role as a link between stress and cardiovascular disease. So what is cortisol? Well, simply put, it's a steroid hormone produced in response to a stressful stimuli or stressor. So under the control of the hypothalamus in the brain and the pituitary, the adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys produce cortisol. And this forms part of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal or HPA axis. And the next question here is, of course, well, to what end? What's the purpose of HPA axis activation and the purpose of cortisol production? And I will revisit this in a bit more detail in a few slides, but very briefly for now, if we were to consider the fight or flight response, cortisol acts on several different tissues to increase the availability of fuel, and it also acts, it contributes, I should say, to the increase in blood pressure. And both of those are necessary adaptations to allow the body to either fight off the threat or to run away. But what about other non-caveman type stressors? Well, for example, the HPA axis watches the clock, if you like. So it's activated and cortisol levels are raised just before waking. And that's in order to prepare the body for the stress of the day ahead. It also responds to nutritional status. For example, starvation is a major stress on the body. Again, in this situation, the HPA axis gets activated and cortisol levels are raised in order to provide fuel for the body. And finally, if you get an injury or infection, similarly, the HPA axis is activated, cortisol levels are raised, and this is in order to suppress the immune response, which is crucial to prevent potentially life-threatening inflammation running loose in your body. And really, the point I want to emphasize here is that in the short term, these acute responses of the body in activating the HPA axis and releasing cortisol are essential adaptive responses to survival. The issues that we run into are when these high cortisol responses are prolonged or maintained over the long term in a way that's no longer appropriate to the circumstances. And what happens is all these adaptive responses, they become maladaptive. And we know this because our clinical colleagues see patients who have tumors that cause cortisol levels to be high all the time. And this is called Cushing's disease. And these patients develop a whole host of clinical problems, including central or visceral obesity associated with diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol levels. Very similar risk factors to those that I showed you for cardiovascular disease. And it'll come as no surprise that these patients have an increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And hopefully now you're starting to see where I'm going with this. Hopefully you can see some of the strands coming together here, because this led to our hypothesis that within the general population, activation for those of us who have activated HPA axis for various reasons will be predisposed to developing these cardiovascular risk factors and therefore be subsequently predisposed to developing cardiovascular disease. So where to begin when trying to address such a hypothesis and how to identify therapeutic targets that might improve our clinical care? Well, a number of years ago, researchers in Edinburgh and indeed around the world established the CORNET consortium. So this is a cortisol network. So this was in 2010, like I said, a worldwide group of researchers investigating cortisol action. And together, combined with the power of modern genetic studies, we've been able to kind of start answering this question of whether higher cortisol is genetically determined. So by assessing the genetic code in a population and putting that together with physiological measurements of cortisol in the same people, we can identify genes that may control cortisol levels. And from over 25,000 people across 17 different populations, the result of that is this lovely Manhattan plot, which may mean nothing to a lot of you, but what you're seeing here is a collection of over 7 million mutations in genetic code. And these are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And this is across the 22 human chromosomes. So I won't go into too much more detail on that, other than to say that a single site or locus was identified from this work as being associated with cortisol levels. And if we were to zoom in on this site on chromosome 14, we can identify that gene of interest as SERPIN-A6. Keep that gene in mind. I'll return to it in a few slides. But for now, I just want to highlight some of the other work that we did here. And from this data set, we were able to use the information, if you like, on people with a genetic predisposition to higher cortisol, and use that in combination with other resources from the UK Biobank. So that's a genetic and health information resource from over 500,000 participants here in the UK. And that allowed us to ask the question, if higher plasma cortisol increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. And using very clever statistical modeling, much too clever for me, called Mendelian randomization, we were able to test whether genetically elevated cortisol is causally associated with cardiovascular outcomes. And indeed, we found statistical evidence that higher cortisol causally increases the risk of heart disease and causally increases the risk of heart attacks. So the big question now, of course, is, well, we've established evidence of cortisol increasing cardiovascular disease risk. How do we go about stopping it? Well, as I've already told you earlier, the stress response is crucial. And so therapies that hit the HPA axis and simply block cortisol, they're not going to work. But as I also mentioned earlier, we do know that cortisol has action on several important tissues. And so we began as researchers to try and unravel the various mechanisms hiding within this black box, if you like, that controls cortisol action within those tissues. And our focus has really been on fat, or what we sometimes call adipose tissue, as a key mediator. And while I don't have the time today to talk in detail about fat, it is important really just to consider that fat is not just what we see after we've had a few too many Christmas puddings. It can come in various forms, and it's found in various parts of our body that you might not even think, including around our blood vessels and even in our bones. Importantly, though, over the years, there have been a number of key studies by ourselves and many others demonstrating that increased cortisol levels, specifically in fat, are capable of driving increased cardiovascular disease through risk factors such as obesity and diabetes. Now, at this point, I could rattle on for hours, I promise I won't, but going through various data. But what is clear is that protecting vulnerable fat tissue from the adverse action of chronically high cortisol levels, this appears to be a really promising route to stop stress-induced cardiovascular disease. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to give you a kind of real up-to-date snapshot of our current research. And so I'm going to highlight over these last few minutes one of the key areas that we're targeting. That, of course, is the gene that we identified in our genetic study. So you'll recall we identified this gene called SERPIN-A6. And this gene makes a protein called corticosteroid binding globulin, or CBG. Lots of acronyms, lots of letters. I do apologize, but we have to name these things. Really, this is a transport molecule for cortisol. It's a delivery van, if you like, with cortisol as its cargo or as its payload. Like a van navigating the roads to deliver its cargo to your door, CBG transports cortisol throughout the circulation, throughout the blood vessels, to deliver it to tissue sites, and it releases that cortisol at those sites. But the question, I guess, is how to persuade you that CBG is a really key, a really crucial player in controlling cortisol action within those tissues. So let's say we're all very familiar with ordering from home, especially over the past couple of years with COVID. Having items delivered to our house has become very popular, and a very obvious challenge is making sure that your delivery gets to the right address. And in terms of CBG, we as researchers want to better understand how it delivers cortisol to vulnerable fat tissue, and importantly, how we can intervene to stop this when it becomes excessive. And again, I won't go into too much detail here, but we believe we've identified a key signal released from fat tissue that facilitates this. And this signal is called neutrophil elastase. It's released from immune cells which enter obese fat tissue. And what's really fascinating is that neutrophil elastase is, to our knowledge, the only molecule produced in the body that cleaves CBG. So what we do is we go from an intact CBG molecule to a cleaved one. And the reason that this is so fascinating for us is because cleaved CBG isn't able to hold on to cortisol. So it ends up dropping it off. And this has led on to our current hypothesis now that the ability of neutrophil elastase to cleave CBG, this increases the delivery of these stress hormones as cortisol to your vulnerable fat tissue, and that this is what drives increased cardiovascular disease risk from stress. In a visual format, if you like, we believe neutrophil elastase present within the fat acts upon CBG within the local blood vessels, cleaving it or cutting it, and then freeing the cortisol. That allows it to enter into the fat cells and act inappropriately. And hopefully in the coming months, we'll be able to share with you our latest publication around this work, demonstrating the importance of this pathway in determining how excess cortisol gets delivered to fat tissue in obesity and how this contributes to diabetes. And also how we might be able to intervene here to combat this through the use of pharmacological neutrophil elastase inhibitors, such as alpha-1 antitrypsin or alafin. I've obviously spoken here a lot about obese fat tissue in the context of preventing diabetes. As I mentioned, there are other types of fat as well, and this pathway is thought to have relevance in some of these sites. So fat tissue that surrounds blood vessels, that ultimately controls blood pressure. And outside of fat, it's also thought to have a potential role in the development of atherosclerotic plaques. And indeed, others have already demonstrated in animal models that in mice lacking neutrophil elastase were protected from the development of atherosclerosis. So we hope this is a really promising avenue of research, and we hope it's a really promising pharmacological target in our search to limit excess cortisol action and to reduce stress-induced cardiovascular risk.
Mark,
so I think with that, I've probably used up my allotted time. This is my second last slide. So I hope today I've demonstrated that while there is a behavioral and emotional response to stress, and indeed there are steps that we can all do to try and take to control those, there is also a biological response that we encounter when we undergo stress. And indeed, there's a genetic component that we're now beginning to understand as to how our bodies respond to this. And this likely determines our cardiovascular risk as well. And that has allowed us to identify opportunities like neutrophil elastase that may be susceptible to treatment to block this adverse action. And of course, that's the justification for the work that we do. So finally, I'd just like to finish by pointing out, obviously, the very many people here in Edinburgh and in other research centres who've contributed to this research field, to thank the BHF and those of you who support our work for funding this research. And again, for giving me the opportunity to share this with you today. I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Mark, thanks very much. That was me coming in from the side. I thought you'd were concluding just a slide before. So, but thank you very much indeed. Very clear, but also I think very clear about the journey ahead in terms of the research and where it could possibly go. So we really appreciate that. We really appreciate Rachel Boothroyd as well. And her story. I'd like to introduce Leanne Grech now. We've got question and answers. We've got pre-submitted questions, which will be taken first. And of course, you've been putting questions as an audience into the sidebar. And I'd also like to introduce at this point, Davison, who's a senior cardiac nurse at the BHF. Yeah.
Thanks, Fearghal. Before I start with the questions, I just want to say a big thank you to Rachel and Mark. Rachel, thank you for sharing your story, for being vulnerable. I found that really refreshing. And Mark, thank you for the great work that you and your team are doing. We've had quite a lot of questions come in, which are best answered by our clinical team, which is why we've invited June today to join us. So just kicking off with the first question. June, what are the many signs that you are placing stress on the heart?
What the signs, did you say? Yeah. So as we've heard from the speakers, that stress is a kind of natural body reaction and the body's way of kind of coping with the challenges placed upon it. So, and that causes this sort of fight or flight reaction, which in the short term, blood pressure goes up, our heart rates goes up. So you can get some kind of immediate kind of sort of heart effects, if you like. In the main, if that stress is short-lived, once it's dampened down, your body can return to a normal state. But I think that what is concerning is that when this continues, when this kind of effect happens continually, then it can be harmful for our health and harmful for our heart. So any signs like that, palpitations, feeling sweaty, breathless, or other signs of stress, feeling tearful and anxious, short-fused, perhaps uninterested in life, it might be a sign that stress is really affecting your health and your heart as well. So at that point, we would say definitely, go to your GP and they can talk about ways to support you. There is now sort of increasing evidence, as we've heard from Mark, that stress the stress hormones can have a direct effect on your risk of cardiovascular disease, and which will be compounded by sort of behavioural risk factors and perhaps unhealthy behaviours. So the sort of telltale signs to look out for in terms of coronary heart disease, which Rachel very kind of nicely illustrated in her story, is if you're getting any chest discomfort, tightness, increasingly feeling breathless, particularly on exertion. That's when it starts. That's the kind of early telltale signs. But other symptoms as well, if you're feeling very tired, if you're feeling dizzy, just sort of generally unwell, they could be signs that actually your heart is starting to be affected. So you really do need, at that point, you definitely, without a doubt, you need to go and get medical help, talk to your doctor for two counts: one, to have a heart health check, but also some tips to kind of help you manage your own stress.
Thanks, June. And can stress cause physical pain in the chest?
Yes, so as I've just sort of said, if your stress is affecting your health and your heart, there is increasing evidence that that could potentially contribute to coronary heart disease, which actually can bring on angina type pains. And we know for sure, we've known for a long time, if you have existing heart disease, if you have existing angina, or you've had a previous heart attack, or you have a condition called heart failure, we know that an emotional upset or a stressful event can actually bring on symptoms or make your heart condition worse. So it can have a direct effect on chest pain there. I think it's important to note, though, that anxiety and stress can actually cause chest pain in a different form. Maybe it could, for example, muscular, where perhaps you're feeling very tense, and you can get some muscular sort of chest pain. So not all chest pain is due to the heart. Sometimes it can be due to a muscular problem. Sometimes it can be due to indigestion, sometimes a chest infection. But it's very, very difficult sometimes to distinguish what is the underlying cause. So that's why it's so important. If you have any type of chest pain, you must go to doctor for an examination and investigations to see if they can establish what the cause is.
Thanks, June. That's really helpful. Had another question about this chap who's had a successful 3-valve replacement, but he says, I now feel stressed and on edge. I am so grateful to be given another chance, but I cannot understand my feelings. Why do I feel more stressed after valve replacement?
Oh, I'm sorry to hear this. Thanks for the question. This is very, very common, and people expect you to be, you've had this and, life's, great and, you're fixed now. But actually, having a big operation like a valve operation can be very traumatic, and can take a lot of psychological adjustment, as with any kind of illness or any surgery or any episode of hospitalization. You know, if people have had a period of feeling unwell, and you know, the fact that they, you know, have had a significant sort of heart condition can be very difficult sort of to come to terms with, and it's very, very common. We get lots and lots of calls like this to our helpline of exactly this. So fortunately for most people it will improve with time, and time is the great healer, and gradually people do generally tend to adjust. I'm not sure where the person who put the question in is with their recovery, but for some people, going to a cardiac rehabilitation course after their procedure or surgery can be very, very helpful. It helps you connect with people, and it makes you feel not on your own, and it helps you kind of get back to what you were doing before as quickly as you can. I know Rachel really mentioned about seeking support and making sure you sort of stay connected to people, and I think that is absolutely vital in anyone who's been through something like this. So you can perhaps join a heart support group, just reach out, talk to your friends and your family. We also have BHF Community, which you can source from our website if you're feeling like you're a bit alone and you want to reach out, and actually you can post something or ask a question, and you'll find that there'll be other people there that have been through similar experiences to you. So yeah, reaching out. We know that if you try and, I mean, it sounds a bit obvious, but we know that if you really do a lot of self-care, that can really help with stress. So making sure you eat well, get outside, get connected with, you know, nature, take up a hobby, try and get lots of rest. They're all sort of tried and tested and established ways for really kind of looking after yourself and helping you manage your stress. But I think at the end of the day, if you're feeling like you can't cope and you're feeling overwhelmed, it is time to see the doctor, and they may be able to suggest some other therapies, perhaps some talking therapy or some counselling.
Thanks, Joan. We have a question about blood pressure, which is actually going to be the topic of next month's Live and Ticking, a little bit of a sneak preview. So the question is, why does my blood pressure increase when I feel stressed? Is there anything that can be done to prevent my blood pressure rising? And how can I stop stress affecting my heart?
Okay, so I think, yeah, it's as we've said already, it's this whole fight or flight reaction that you get to the stressor. So that produces adrenaline, which makes the blood pressure go up. And for the main people, if the stress is short-lived, the blood pressure will reduce when that stress is removed. But yeah, it can become problematic if the stress just sort of continues. So was the question about how to stop the blood pressure rising? Yeah. So I think, I mean, in the particular moment, things like perhaps some breathing exercises, taking yourself away from the situation, perhaps just going for a walk outside, trying some other sort of therapies, kind of whatever works for you. It might be just some relaxation or some meditation, or going to put the radio on, put some music on, maybe sort of taking yourself away from that sort of stressful situation as much as you can. Often it's very difficult to kind of, we've only got so much control over the stressor. So a lot of it is about thinking about what makes you feel stressed and what you might be able to do when you're in that stressful situation to try and cope with it. I think the other thing to say about blood pressure is that there are many sort of lifestyle things that can be done as well to help sort of prevent it from getting high in the first instance. We know that, having too much salt in your diet and having excess alcohol can actually increase your blood pressure. And conversely, we know that keeping active and getting outside and keeping walking can actually help to reduce your blood pressure. So doing some of those lifestyle things as well can be very helpful.
Another question is about antidepressants and whether they can be taken safely if you have ventricular ectopic beats, which appear to be worsened by anxiety and stress. So essentially, can antidepressants be taken if you have ventricular beats?
Okay. So I think that will depend really on the type of antidepressant that the person's on. I mean, there's many different types of categories of antidepressants, but we do know that certain types of antidepressants can trigger heart rhythm problems or can trigger palpitations. So in some instances, they might not be suitable for everybody, but that would be kind of for a doctor to decide on an individual basis, depending on what arrhythmia that person has. That said, many people with heart disease take antidepressants. They're a very effective treatment for anxiety and stress, and can help with some of the symptoms. So that's not to say that if someone has a heart rhythm problem, they can't take antidepressants, but I think it's a decision that we made on an individual basis, but by someone's doctor. So best to seek your GP's advice on that one.
Thanks, Juno. One last question for you before I move on to some questions for Mark and Rachel. What is the recommendation to help patients with pre-existing panic disorder or social anxiety? And they're saying that rapid heartbeats and high blood pressure are the main symptoms. I know you've touched upon this a little bit already.
Yeah. Well, I think if somebody has that as a diagnosis, hopefully they'll be having support and care from a medical team. If they're not, then you absolutely go to your GP, who hopefully will refer you for some specialist therapy, or perhaps a mental health specialist to help you with those issues. A lot of the sort of therapies and treatments are all the things that we've kind of just sort of been talking about. A lot of self-care, looking after yourself, eating well, making sure you're getting good rest, keeping active, and thinking about some of the therapies that kind of may help you. So that might, for some, and again, that's going to be different for everybody. So for some people, that might be some breathing exercises, it might be some sort of form of meditation, some relaxation. It's kind of whatever works for you. But I think the key thing is making sure that you talk to people, that you get support, and that you're not there struggling on your own.
Thanks, June. That's really good advice. I sometimes forget to breathe, and then I have to remind myself to keep breathing. So thank you very much for joining us today, June.
You're welcome.
Pleasure. We have a few questions for you, Mark. So the first question is, what is the current state of the evidence in relation to stress as a direct risk factor for cardiovascular disease, rather than in terms of it influencing lifestyle behaviors?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's something we've really only started answering very recently, and that's a publication that I showed you from 2021, where that had that blue Manhattan plot, if you remember. So that publication was really our efforts at showing that there is a direct link now that we've shown between the levels of stress hormones and cardiovascular disease, and that removes the confounding factors, if you like, of the other kind of lifestyle things that we talked about. So yeah, a great question, and yes, the answer is yes, there is now a direct link that we've shown.
Thanks, Mark. And another question is that you said starvation is a trigger for increased cortisol. Now, what are your thoughts on intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding for health? It's a good question, isn't it?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah. So intermittent fasting, obviously it's kind of a big craze, I guess you could call it, recently. It's definitely been shown to have some health benefits, I guess. My understanding of the literature around intermittent fasting and stress hormones is that if you do intermittent fasting for a prolonged period, it can certainly cause an elevation in your cortisol levels. I think probably we're lacking enough data at the minute to determine really the impact of intermittent fasting on cortisol. But from what's out there that I know of, it influences the rhythmicity of our cortisol release. So cortisol is a hormone that gets released, as I said, it's really high at the start of the day when we're about to wake up, and then it falls throughout the day. That's called a diurnal response, if you like. So high in the morning, low in the evening. And what happens when you undertake intermittent fasting is you kind of mess a little bit with that rhythmicity, and that's not good really over the long term. So if you imagine it's not a very good analogy, but it's similar, if you like, to shift workers. So shift workers have a bit of a messed up diurnal rhythm because they're working during the night and sleeping during the day, perhaps. And we know that shift workers are more at risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So I'm not saying, of course, that intermittent fasting is going to do that. I'm just saying that that's where the data is heading at the minute, but we don't have enough data to be able to show that. But a really, really good question.
Thank you, Mark. And Rachel, if you wouldn't mind answering this question, I think the theme from the chat and the comments is that people have found your story so inspiring. A lot of people have related as well to your story. And one question that I think would be really last good question to answer is, if you could go back and give yourself any advice before your diagnosis, what would it be? Enlighten us.
Longer term back would be listen to the need to change career sooner. Closer to the event would be to inquire more. Don't take one answer if you don't think it's the right one. I was given this misdiagnosis of something super rare, and it didn't feel quite right to me. One of my teachers said, don't be a patient. It's my health is my responsibility, right? So I don't think I really took that. I sort of went and said, oh, well, that's what they said, and then resigned from it. I think I could have done more to really say, this isn't right, and just really listen to my body, not my head.
That's good advice, great advice. Thank you, Rachel. I think that's all the questions we have for now, Fearghal, if you wouldn't mind closing the event. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
That's another pound in the charity box. I'd just like to thank you all for joining us today. We, brilliant speakers, Rachel, Mark, everybody for joining us today and for your questions. And and for your understanding now, perhaps, of how your support helps us to fund groundbreaking research. Just on the poll question again, perhaps we could throw out, how would you rate your understanding now of how stress affects the heart? So 1 again being very little, and 5 a lot. So let just that digest for just a second. I'd like to thank June, of course, for all her answers as well. And if we haven't managed to answer your question in this session, we encourage you again to visit our dedicated heart helpline if you'd like to speak to one of our clinical team. June outlined that earlier. David's putting up a link to that now. We'd like you to give your feedback and suggestions by completing our online survey that will be sent via email. That helps to shape future events. And if you've been particularly inspired by our work on stress in the heart, we need to fund it, and all donations to support our cause and vital research are really very much appreciated. And there is a link to donate should viewers wish to do so at the end of the event. Just a reminder that this event was recorded and will be available on our website from next week. Our next live and ticking event will take place on the 25th of May, and as Leanne hinted, on the topic of blood pressure. More than 14 million adults in the UK have high blood pressure, and as a result have an increased risk of heart disease and stroke. You can discover the work we're doing to understand the causes of high blood pressure, and as well, and new and better ways to treat. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again for visiting us today and engaging, and for all the range of your questions. And thank you again to our inspirational speakers. Goodbye.